The wind cut through the valley like a blade, cold and merciless, carrying with it the faint cry of a hawk circling high above. Dust swirled along the dirt road where a wagon creaked under the weight of its wooden frame. Inside sat a girl no older than 19, her wrists raw from the rough cord that bound them. Her face was pale, her lips cracked, and her eyes, once bright with dreams, now held only the hollow reflection of betrayal. Her family had told her she was weak, a burden, useless. Her father spat when he signed her away for a sack of grain and a jug of whiskey. The word clung to her like frostbite, eating at what little pride she still possessed. She remembered the way her mother turned her face, unwilling to meet her eyes, and the way her brothers stared at the ground, ashamed but unwilling to speak. No one fought for her. No one begged her to stay. The traders treated her as they would a horse or a mule, something bartered, something disposable. She sat in the wagon as it jolted forward, surrounded by the groan of leather harnesses and the stomping hooves of beasts of burden. The world outside blurred into gray pines and distant mountains, vast and unyielding. Somewhere in that wilderness, her fate waited. She closed her eyes, but rest offered no comfort. Her body shivered despite the layers of worn cloth clinging to her shoulders. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, yet she could not bring herself to ask for food. Each time the wagon hit a rut, pain shot through her legs, and she wondered how long it would be before she was cast aside. The frontier was not kind to the weak. She had heard stories of women traded between men, left to die in the wilderness, or worse. Yet beneath the fear, a small ember of defiance smoldered. She told herself she would not weep. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg. If this land wanted to kill her, it would have to try harder. The wagon rolled deeper into the mountains. Clouds gathered, thick and heavy, hiding the sun until the sky turned the color of iron. The traders muttered among themselves, glancing nervously at the peaks. One spat over the side, muttering about storms and spirits that haunted the ridges. She sat silent, clutching the frayed edge of her shawl, listening. The air felt heavy, as if the earth itself held its breath. When the first drops of rain struck the wagon boards, she flinched. Within moments, the drizzle turned into a downpour, hammering the canvas cover until water leaked through in cold rivulets. The wagon lurched, horses whinnying in protest as mud sucked at their hooves. The traders cursed, struggling to keep the team under control. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the ridges like jagged scars. She pressed herself against the corner, eyes wide, heart racing. The storm felt like an omen, a judgment from something greater than man. And in that moment, as thunder roared, the wagon tilted sharply to one side. A wheel struck a hidden stone. The jolt threw her against the boards. The next instant, she was tumbling, the world spinning until she hit the ground with bone-jarring force. Mud filled her mouth. She gagged, coughing, as hooves thundered past her face. The wagon surged forward, its wheels splashing through the muck. For one fleeting heartbeat, she thought they might stop, come back for her. But the shouts of the traders grew fainter, drowned by the storm. In moments, the wagon disappeared into the curtain of rain, leaving her sprawled in the mud like cast-off cargo. The cold seeped in her bones as she struggled to sit up. Her hands trembled as she clawed at the ropes, binding her wrists. Her hair clung to her face, soaked through. Alone, utterly alone, she let out a shaky breath, staring into the darkening forest. The towering pines loomed like watchmen, silent and unyielding. A sob threatened to rise, but she bit it back, pressing her teeth together until her jaw ached. She would not cry. She had cried enough in her father's house, enough to last a lifetime. Instead, she forced herself to her knees. Each movement was agony, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she was alive. Somewhere in the storm, wolves howled. The sound was distant but unmistakable, echoing through the ridges like a dirge. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she turned toward the sound instinctively, though there was nowhere to run. With her hands bound, no weapon, no shelter, she was little more than prey. Still, she rose to her feet. The mud clung to her skirts, pulling her down, but she stumbled forward, deeper into the trees. The rain stung her skin, the cold biting at her flesh, but movement was survival. If she lay down, if she surrendered, the wilderness would finish what her family had begun. The storm raged on, and her steps grew weaker. Darkness crept through the forest, each shadow twisting into threat. She prayed, silently, desperately, that someone, anyone, might hear her, that this night would not be her last. Far off, between the trees, a flicker of light broke through the storm. A single ember, glowing faint against the black. She froze, breath shallow, unsure if it was a trick of her weary eyes or salvation. The light wavered once, then steadied. Fire. Her legs carried her forward, stumbling, desperate. Each step closer to that fragile glow felt like defying death itself. She did not know who waited by that fire. A traitor? A trap? Or something worse? But she knew only one truth. To stay in the dark was to die. And so, with the storm roaring above and wolves crying in the distance, she pushed forward toward the flame, unaware that her fate was about to change forever. Rain poured down in sheets, drumming against the forest canopy, turning the ground into a mire of sucking mud and slick roots. Her breath came ragged, each inhale burning as she stumbled toward that fragile glimmer in the distance. The fire was closer now, no trick of her eyes. Real, warmth, life. She pushed forward until her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the base of a pine. Through blurred vision, she saw him, a figure crouched by the fire, hat pulled low, a long rifle leaning against a stump beside him. His movements were slow, deliberate, stacking damp logs, coaxing reluctant flame. He hadn't seen her yet. For a moment, she froze, torn between hope and fear. The man's shoulders were broad, his frame solid, his beard thick and unkempt. He looked like the wilderness itself had shaped him, hard and unforgiving. Her voice cracked when she tried to speak, barely more than a whisper carried off by the wind. But the snap of a branch beneath her hand betrayed her presence. His head lifted sharply. In a single motion, he had the rifle in his grip, eyes sharp, fixed on her shadow through the storm. She raised her bound hands, trembling. Please! It was all she managed before her legs gave way, and she fell into the mud again. For a heartbeat, the fire crackled and the storm howled, filling the silence between them. Then his boots splashed through the puddles, coming closer. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for whatever fate would come. A rough hand gripped her shoulder, rolling her onto her back. His face loomed above hers, cut by the glow of firelight. Weathered, lined by years of solitude. Eyes dark, unreadable. "You're half dead," he muttered, voice deep as the mountain. She tried to answer, but her teeth chattered too hard. He grunted, then with a swift pull of his hunting knife, sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The cords fell away, leaving raw red marks. Before she could react, he hauled her to her feet and half-dragged, half-carried her toward the fire. Heat hit her like a wave. Steam rose from her soaked clothes as he pushed her down beside the flames. She curled close, shivering violently. He threw a blanket, rough wool, smelling of smoke, over her shoulders. "Where'd you come from?" His question was curt, not gentle. She swallowed, voice faint. "Traitors. Wagon, left me." His jaw tightened. He spat into the fire. Figures. Then silence again. The fire popped, sparks rising into the storm-choked sky. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he returned to his seat across from her. He moved with the certainty of a man long accustomed to being alone. Every action was precise. Drawing his rifle, checking the flint, laying strips of venison on a flat stone by the fire. He did not look at her often, but when he did, his gaze was sharp enough to cut. The scent of meat filled the air. Her stomach twisted painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, yet she dared not ask. At last, he tore a piece from the strip and thrust it toward her. She hesitated, then accepted it with trembling hands. The first bite nearly broke her. It was tough, smoky, but it was food, and it tasted of salvation. Neither spoke for some time. The storm raged. but the fire carved a small circle of safety around them. Slowly, her shivers eased. Slowly, she allowed herself to breathe. "Name," he said at last. She glanced up, startled. "Eliza." He gave a short nod. "Jonah." Nothing more. His eyes lingered on her longer this time, studying. She wondered what he saw. A girl thrown away like refuse, fragile and broken? Or something else, hidden even from herself? The night deepened. Wolves howled again, closer now. Jonah stood, rifle in hand, his body rigid. "They'll circle close in weather like this," he muttered. His eyes flicked toward her. "Stay near the fire. Don't move." Fear prickled her skin. She nodded quickly, pulling the blanket tighter. He vanished into the trees, a shadow swallowed by storm and forest. Every snap of a branch set her heart racing. Every gust of wind felt like a predator's breath. She gripped the blanket, whispering prayers into the dark. At last, the brush rustled and Jonah returned. He shook his hat, water dripping from the brim, then crouched by the fire. "They're close, but they won't come while it burns." She dared to whisper, "What if the fire dies?" His eyes met hers across the flames. "Then you'd better pray I can shoot straight." For the first time, something flickered between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two souls caught in the teeth of the wilderness, clinging to a fragile firelight against the dark. The storm wore itself out by dawn. The forest dripped with silver rain, fog curling through the pines. Eliza stirred beneath the blanket, stiff but alive. Jonah was already awake, tending to the fire, his hat pulled low. "You'll need to move," he said without looking at her. "No place for strays out here. Not safe." Her throat tightened. "Where would I go?" He finally turned, eyes hard, but softened by a shadow of something unspoken. "Regret, maybe. Or pity." He sighed. "You'll follow me. For now." She wanted to ask why. Why save her? Why not leave her in the mud as others had? But she bit back the words. Instead, she pulled the blanket tight and rose to her feet, unsteady but determined. Together they stepped into the mist-shrouded woods, the fire left smoldering behind them. Wolves still prowled, and dangers unseen lay ahead, but for the first time since her family cast her out, Eliza was not alone. The wilderness was vast. The man beside her was a stranger, his past hidden in silence. But something inside her whispered that her story had not ended in the mud. It was only beginning. The mountains stretched out endless and cruel, their ridges rising like jagged teeth against the sky. Days blurred into each other as Eliza followed Jonah through the wilderness, her body aching with every step. The land was unforgiving, steep inclines, icy rivers, and forests so thick the sun barely pierced through. Yet with each trial, something inside her hardened. The first time Jonah handed her an axe, she nearly dropped it from the weight. His gaze lingered on her, unreadable, before he turned back to split a log with one clean strike. "What keeps you alive out here," he said. "Fire's the difference between living and being meat for the wolves." Her hands blistered that first day. Every swing felt clumsy, useless. She wanted to throw the axe aside and collapse, but Jonah's silence pressed heavier than words. So she swung again, and again. By nightfall, her arms burned, her palms were raw, but a neat stack of split logs stood beside her. For the first time in years, pride flickered in her chest. Each day brought a new lesson. Jonah showed her how to strip bark for tinder, how to listen for the rustle of game in the undergrowth, how to tell which berries would kill and which would nourish. At first, his instructions were curt, nothing more than survival demands. But slowly, as she struggled and learned, his tone shifted. He corrected her stance when she missed a rabbit with the bow. He grunted approval when she mended a torn blanket with steady stitches. One evening, while the fire cracked and the shadows stretched long, she dared to ask him, "Why do you live out here, alone?" For a long time, he said nothing. The firelight carved harsh lines across his face, revealing a man carved by loss. At last, his voice came low, rough. "Because there's no one left to live with." The answer silenced her. She didn't press further, but the heaviness in his words lingered. She saw it in the way his eyes drifted to the horizon, in the way he carried his solitude like armor. A man escaping something, or someone too painful to face. Their uneasy rhythm shattered one morning when the echo of hooves thundered through the trees. Jonah stiffened, rifle in hand. "Bandits," he muttered, his jaw tight. Before she could ask, men emerged from the tree-line. 3 of them, dirty, eyes sharp with hunger and greed. Their leader grinned when he saw Eliza. "Well now, what have we here?" Jonah stepped between them, rifle raised. "She's not yours." The bandits laughed. One spat into the dirt. "Everything out here's ours, old man. Even her." Eliza's blood turned cold. The world slowed, the air thick with dread. Jonah's finger tightened on the trigger, but there were 3 of them, and only one of him. Her breath caught, waiting for the inevitable crack of gunfire. But the leader only smirked. Another time, he sneered, motioning his men away. "We'll be back, and when we do, she'll be ours." They vanished into the trees, leaving behind the stench of threat. Jonah lowered the rifle, eyes dark. Eliza's hands shook as she clutched her shawl, bile rising in her throat. That night, she sat silent by the fire, heart pounding with fear. Jonah said nothing, but she saw the storm in his expression, the weight of danger pressing on both of them. She realized then, out here, survival wasn't just about wolves and storms. Men were the true predators. Days passed with tension coiled between them. Jonah grew restless, always watching the trees, always listening. Eliza pushed herself harder, determined not to be the burden her family had claimed she was. She practiced with the bow until her fingers bled. She gathered herbs, stitched torn clothes, cooked meals from scraps. And in those small victories, she found strength she never knew she had. One night, Jonah staggered back to camp, blood streaking down his arm from a scrape with a wild boar. His face was pale, breath ragged. Without hesitation, Eliza tore strips from her dress, pressing them against the wound. He tried to wave her off, but she snapped, "Be still." Surprised by her sudden fire, he obeyed. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she did not falter. When the bleeding slowed, Jonah looked at her, something unspoken in his gaze. Respect, maybe even trust. Later, as the fire dimmed, he murmured words she barely caught. "Didn't think you'd last this long." She met his eyes, her voice steady. "Neither did I." In that moment, the wall between them cracked, just enough for her to glimpse the man beneath the silence. A man scarred, yes, but not heartless. A man who chose to save her when the world had cast her aside. Still, the shadow of the bandits hung over them. Every snapped twig, every distant shout in the wind made her heart lurch. They would return. She knew it. Jonah knew it. The wilderness was vast, but not vast enough to hide forever. And when they came, she would have to decide whether she was still the girl her family had sold as useless, or something far stronger. The wind carried the stench of smoke before they saw it. Jonah froze, nostrils flaring as his hand tightened on the rifle. Eliza followed his gaze toward the horizon where a faint smear of gray curled above the tree-line. Not storm clouds. Campfire smoke. Too much of it. "They've come back," Jonah muttered, his voice grim. Her stomach dropped. The bandits. She remembered their leader's grin, the promise in his eyes. They hadn't forgotten. They had been waiting, watching. Jonah crouched low, scanning the forest. "We've got 2 choices," he said, calm but edged with steel. "Run or fight." Fear clawed at her, but she forced herself to steady her breath. The girl who had once sat bound in a wagon was gone. She thought of the axe, the bow, the hours of sweat and blood poured into survival. She thought of the firelight nights and Jonah's unspoken trust. Her voice came quiet but firm. "We fight." For the first time, Jonah looked at her not as a burden, not as someone he had to protect, but as an equal. He gave a single nod. Then, "Fight we will." They prepared in silence. Jonah checked his rifle, measured powder and shot. Eliza gathered arrows, tightened the bowstring, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. She set traps along the narrow deer trail leading to their camp. Snares, sharpened stakes, small but deadly tricks Jonah had taught her. The forest grew heavy with anticipation. Every bird call seemed to hush, every leaf rustle sharpened. Then came the sound, hooves pounding, branches snapping, voices rough and eager. The bandits were closing in. Jonah crouched behind a fallen log, rifle aimed. Eliza waited beside him, bow drawn, breath tight in her throat. Shadows moved between the trees. 3 men, then 4, more than before. The leader's voice rang out, mocking. "Old man, we've come for what's ours. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you live." Jonah's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Silence was his reply. The leader laughed. "Have it your way." The woods erupted. Gunfire cracked, echoing off the ridges. Jonah fired, the recoil slamming into his shoulder, dropping one man where he stood. Eliza loosed an arrow, her aim true, grazing another's arm. The bandits shouted, scattering into cover. Chaos consumed the clearing. Smoke, thunder, the snap of branches under rushing boots. Jonah moved like a man possessed, firing, reloading, moving again. Eliza's heart pounded as she shot arrow after arrow, her arms burning, each release fueled by raw defiance. A shout rang behind her. She spun too late. A bandit lunged, grabbing her arm, wrenching the bow away. She cried out, struggling as his knife flashed in the firelight. Panic flared, but instinct roared louder. She drove her knee into his gut, snatched a rock from the ground, and struck. He crumpled, stunned. Breathless, she scrambled free, seizing the knife he'd dropped. Across the clearing, Jonah fell to one knee, blood staining his shirt. A bullet had torn through his side. Eliza's vision tunneled. The leader loomed over him, revolver aimed at his chest. "Should have stayed in your hole, mountain rat," the man sneered. "Now you'll watch me take what's mine." Something inside Eliza broke and rebuilt in the same instant. She surged forward, knife in hand, no longer prey, but predator. The leader turned too late. She slammed the blade across his arm, the revolver clattering to the ground. He roared, swinging at her, but Jonah, with a final burst of strength, drove the butt of his rifle into the man's skull. The bandit fell, unconscious, sprawled in the dirt. The last of the raiders fled into the trees, their courage shattered. Silence descended, broken only by the rasp of Jonah's breath. Eliza dropped to his side, pressing her hands to the bleeding wound. "Stay with me," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare leave me now." He winced, but his eyes held hers, steady despite the pain. "You fought," he managed, his voice ragged. Tears blurred her vision, though her hands remained strong. "Because you taught me. Because you didn't leave me to die." The long night stretched on as she worked to stop the bleeding, feeding the fire, watching over him as the forest held its breath. By dawn, the worst had passed. Jonah's face was pale, but his chest rose and fell, stubborn as ever. Weeks slipped by in recovery. Eliza tended the wound, hunted, split wood, carried the weight of both their lives on her shoulders. And with every sunrise, she felt herself changing, no longer a girl discarded, but a woman forged by fire and blood. When Jonah could finally stand again, he led her to a clearing he had long kept hidden. The ground there was rich, the air quiet, the view of the valley endless. He stood a long while, silent as always, before speaking. "A place like this," he said, "deserves more than a campfire. Deserves a home." Confused, she glanced at him. His eyes, weathered, scarred, met hers. He set his rifle aside and began marking the ground with a stick. Straight lines, corners. "A cabin," he said simply. "Not just for me anymore." Her breath caught. She understood then, not in words, but in the weight of his actions. He wasn't claiming her as property, as her family had sold her. He was offering something else. A life, a place, a choice. Together, they built it. Day after day, they raised the walls, laid the beams, their hands blistered and backs aching. It was no palace, just logs and stone, but each stroke of the axe, each nail driven deep, bound them tighter than any vow spoken by strangers. When at last the cabin stood, sturdy against the wind, Jonah placed his hand on the frame and looked at her. His voice was rough, quiet. "Wife, A word not of ownership, but of belonging. Eliza's eyes burned as she touched the wall with trembling fingers. She had been sold as useless, abandoned to die. Yet here she stood, alive, stronger than she had ever been. And for the first time, she felt not discarded, but chosen. The mountains remained vast, dangerous, unforgiving. Bandits would return, storms would rage, wolves would prowl. But within those walls, they had carved out something rare. Not safety, perhaps, but meaning. A bond born of fire and blood, unshakable. And so their story settled into the silence of the wilderness. Not a fairy tale, not an ending of ease, but a beginning shaped by resilience. A life carved from the very land that sought to kill them. As the sun dipped beyond the ridges, painting the valley gold, Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin, the mountain air filling her lungs. She was no longer the girl her family had sold. She was something else entirely. She was alive. She was free. And the mountains, at last, had given her a home. Narrator's closing/CTA. If this story stirred something in you, if Eliza's fight for survival, for dignity, spoke to your heart, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts below, subscribe for more frontier tales, and let us keep these echoes of resilience alive together. Out here on the edge of history, every story is a fire in the dark, and your voice keeps it burning.